Hi guys, this is Shelte, and in this video series I will try to go over each class on Turtle WoW, covering all their changes, their new abilities, and how these might affect their capabilities in both leveling, PvE and PvP, as well as how they might create new opportunities for new builds and playstyles. And in today's video we'll be taking a closer look at the Shaman here in Turtle WoW. First of all, we'll be taking a look at the new abilities that the Shaman has received, and after that I'll be covering their talent changes. And lastly, we'll be taking a deep dive into each of the Shaman's three specs: Elemental, Enhancement and Restoration. I used to play as orcs back in Warcraft 3. I especially loved the shamans with their bloodlust, and Thrall with his wolves and chain lightning. So when World of Warcraft came, I was so hyped to play my shaman, expecting to be dual wielding claws, casting chain lightning, casting bloodlusts and summoning wolves. You can imagine my disappointment when I leveled my shaman just to realize that he didn't use claws. He didn't have Bloodlust and he couldn't summon wolves. At least I could cast Chain Lightning and Lightning Shield. Though Bloodlust and wolves came in later expansions, I always wondered why it wasn't part of the Shaman toolkit from the beginning. Why were these abilities not baseline? But here we are now on Turtle WoW, and I can finally play the Shaman that I always wanted to play back in vanilla. All while it still feels like vanilla, without all the gunk and clusterfuck from later expansions. But that's a rant for another time. For now, let's jump into the game and take a look at the changes made here on Turtle WoW. But first, let's read the words of the developers. Elemental and Enhancement both have struggles in PvE. That can be addressed somewhat easily. Restoration is pretty solid in vanilla, but its talent tree leaves a lot to be desired. Something to keep in mind for the future. Definitely the enhancement shaman for PvE needed a lot of help, and the biggest problem with Elemental was probably mana, for PvE at least. Elemental is quite strong in PvP in my opinion. But let's see here. They say changes to baseline spells, and then they write Storm Strike now has 2 ranks. Rank 2 learnable at level 60, cooldown 12 seconds as opposed to 20 seconds for rank 1, and rank 2 costs 12% of base mana as opposed to 21% of base mana at rank 1. So reduced cooldown, reduced mana cost for the new rank, which is learnable at level 60. And one more thing to note about the reduced mana cost. You have to remember that base mana and total mana is not the same. Base mana is the amount of mana that you have without accounting for gear, while total mana is the amount of mana that you have, both the base mana and the mana you get when you have all of your gear equipped. Right, moving on to new racials. So just like the different types of shaman in Warcraft 3 have different abilities, the different types of shaman here on Turtle WoW also have different abilities. Through a long quest chain specific to each shaman race, they will learn their new race-specific shaman ability. Orc shamans learn Feral Spirit, summons 2 Spirit Wolves under the command of the shaman for 20 seconds, costs 21 base mana, cooldown 5 minutes. Wait, that's wrong. It's actually 4-minute cooldown. And as you can see, this isn't a huge amount of damage, but it adds some flavor to the class, and it's probably very useful in PvP against casters with the constant interruption. Moving on to the Taurens. The Tauren shamans learn Spirit Link. Link the spirits of an ally and their 3 closest allies within 15 yards together. When linked targets take damage, 15% is distributed among the other linked allies. Lasts 20 seconds, costs 21% of base mana, cooldown 10 minutes. And that has actually also been changed, so now it's 20 seconds instead of 10 minutes, so that's a pretty big change for our Tauren shamans here. And then lastly we have Troll Shamans. They learn Hex, transform the enemy into a frog that cannot cast and does 60% less damage for 5 seconds. Only works on beasts, humanoids and critters. Cost 21% base mana, cooldown 5 minutes. And your Shaman racial ability can be acquired through a quest, which becomes available at level 40 from your Shaman class trainer. I gotta say, I just love the idea of race-specific abilities for Shamans. It fits really well with the lore. Overall, it just creates more immersion in the game. So I'm a big fan. And just like the priests, because before it was only the priest that had these race-specific abilities, but now also the Shaman has them. So it's a nice little thing. All right, moving on to new abilities. And these are the abilities that every Shaman get no matter your race. So first off we have Calm Elements. Calms the target, reducing the range at which it will attack you by 10 yards. Only affects elemental targets from level 70 or lower. Lasts 15 seconds. Next up here we have Water Shield. The caster is surrounded by 3 globes of water. When a spell, melee or ranged attack hits the caster, 83 mana is restored to the caster. This expends 1 water globe. Only 1 globe will activate every few seconds. Lasts 10 minutes. This is a little bit more mana sustain. It isn't really the same as what we got in Burning Crusade, because in the Burning Crusade, if you remember, there was a passive MP5 component to it. Moving on to Earth Shield. The caster is surrounded by an Earthen Shield, giving 30% chance of ignoring spell interruption when damaged and causing attacks to heal the shielded target by 150. This effect can only occur once every few seconds, 3 charges, lasts 10 minutes. In Burning Crusade you get Water Shield baseline, but Earth Shield has always been something that you had to go into deep restoration to get. Now it's baseline for all Shamans, plus the 30% chance to ignore spell interruption, which is huge when you're as elemental casting your spells. Getting less pushback is going to be really good especially for PvP. Another thing that we found with Earth Shield here is that it actually scales with your plus healing gear. So in this case, PBA has equipped 100 plus healing gear, and as you can see, it's giving him a bit more healing every tick. It seems to be scaling with around 30% with your healing power, and it's also able to crit. And then lastly there is Totemic Recall. Returns your totems to the earth, giving you 25% of the mana required to cast each totem destroyed by Totemic Recall. I think it's the exact same as we got in Burning Crusade. It's really nice to have, because in raids, if you've ever raided as a Shaman or with Shamans, there's always somebody who pulls with a totem. To prevent that, you'd always have to replace your totems as soon as you arrive to, say you're moving through Blackwing layers, what's the room called with all the whelps and all this that keeps respawning? I can't remember that. But you keep moving through that, and if the Shaman, he puts down a totem, and if he doesn't replace it every time he arrives at a new stop or a new destination, that previous totem is going to pull the entire room and the back end. So with Totemic Recall, just like in Burning Crusade, you can just press Totemic Recall and it will destroy the totem, so it won't pull anymore. And now let's take a look at some talent changes. First off, enhancement. Two-handed weapons. So now two-handed weapons will be learned on character creation instead of being acquired from row 3 in enhancement. Now, whenever you create a Shaman, you just learn two-handed weapon specialization or two-handed weapons. Before, you had to get to level 15 before you could actually start to use two-handed weapons. And then you had to put a talent in
to get it. I think Shaman is probably the only class in the game that had to spend talent points to use a specific type of weapon, while all other classes could just visit the weapons master and learn whatever weapon specialization. The Shaman had to spend a talent point in order to get your two-handed weapons. So it's a needed change in my opinion. But it was here, and now we have Thunderhead here. So Thunderhead allows your lightning shield to be cast on allies and reduces its mana cost by 20%, only usable at one ally at a time. And then the next one that got removed is Parry. Parry will now be learnable at level 6 from your class trainer instead of being acquired from row 5 of the enhancement tree, making room for new talent. And as you can see, Stormstrike has been moved up to replace this parry talent. So instead of parry, you have Stormstrike, and you get Stormstrike now 10 levels earlier. So now you get Stormstrike at level 30 instead of level 40. And that is to make room for a new talent at the bottom of the tree, which is Bloodlust. Increases melee, ranged, and spell casting speed by 15% for a target party member within 30 yards. Lasts 20 seconds. So this can be cast on any party member, or it can be cast on yourself. But it has a 5-minute cooldown, so that's a really long cooldown. Another talent that has been changed or remade. Before you had Anticipation here, now you have Ancestral Guardian. And Anticipation usually only gave you 1 dodge per point, but now it also gives you increased armor from items. So it's actually toughness and Anticipation that has been merged into one called Ancestral Guardian, which now gives you up to 5% dodge chance and 10% extra armor from your items. And that is to make room for a new talent where toughness was before. Now we have Spirit Armor, increases the armor gained from shields by 10, 20 and 30%. And actually Shamans are actually decent dungeon tanks in Classic. They can actually produce a lot of threat from Rockbiter, Lightning Shield, and then also you have Earth Shock, which also causes a high amount of threat. Combining this with Chain Lightning, so say you pull with Chain Lightning and you use Rockbiter and Earth Shock to generate extra threat, combined with the extra dodge and armor now you get from your items. Actually capable tanks now, or at least they are slightly better tanks than they were before with this extra armor buff, because they are still using mail armor compared to paladins and warriors who are using plate armor. I'd say that the paladin received more buffs on and overall a stronger tank than the shaman still, so I think they could do more to increase the shaman's tanking capability, so that you'd have equal amount of tanks on both Horde and Alliance side. I don't think he'll be able to survive as much as say a Paladin or a Warrior will. But also the shields are fitting for tanking, increasing health from whenever you get hit with a short internal cooldown, of course. And also Mana Shield, which will help with him sustaining mana when tank, is also quite useful. But I think slightly more could be done, especially deep down here in the tree. Maybe something with totems increasing the tanking capability of shamans, and just maybe overall more talents that have a more emphasis on tanking, so you'd have to sacrifice offensive abilities for tanking abilities. Because of course, if the shaman is just as strong in offensive abilities than he is in the defensive capabilities, then he'd be overpowered and too powerful in PvP. But you could balance it by creating more talents, which require many talent points, so you have less talent points to spend on things that increases offensive abilities, if that makes sense. Alright, moving on to Elemental. They've actually only made one change in the Elemental talent tree, which is Elemental Focus. Before the change, it gave you a 10% chance to enter a clear casting state, which would reduce the mana cost of your next spell by 100%, but it only had a 10% chance of proccing, and it was a random proc. It wasn't dependent on anything. In Burning Crusade, they changed that so that every time you would get a crit, it would reduce the cost of your next spellcast. And they've made the same change in here, so after landing a critical strike with a Fire, Frost or nature damage spell, or melee attack, I have to put emphasis on that because we'll dive into that later, you enter a clear casting state. The clear casting state reduces the mana cost of your next 2 damage spells by 40%. So this is close to the change that they made in in the Burning Crusade, but it has another component to it. In the enhancement tree, there was a talent called Shamanistic Focus, which was the one in the Burning Crusade, which replaced the two-handed weapon specialization there. And that talent, whenever you gained after landing a melee critical strike, you would enter a focus state. The focus state would reduce the mana cost of your next shock spell by 60%. So these two, in a way, has been moved into one talent in the elemental talent tree called Elemental Focus. So now Elemental Focus, it works not only from spells, but it also works from melee attack. Critting with a melee attack reduces the mana cost of any of your offensive spells by 40%. So now when leveling, you would probably go for this talent before anything else. But that's pretty much it for the changes in the elemental talent tree. Nothing else has really changed. And then when you look on their webpage, it doesn't say anything about restoration. So there are no changes in restoration according to their webpage, but there actually is a little change. They've just moved around two talents. So Nature's Guidance was down here before and has changed places with Ancestral Healing. So these two have just swapped places. This makes it a lot easier to get your 3% extra hit than it usually would. So now you get extra hit earlier in the tree, and this is hit with both spells and melee attack, which is very useful when leveling. And I think this is also made to make it easier for endgame when playing enhancement in raids. So now you can get hit easier, which leaves more talents to be spent in the elemental talent tree. So now you can actually get both the extra hit from Nature's Guidance. You can also get Elemental Focus, while in the end having 31 talent points in enhancement. So getting Bloodlust, getting your hit, and getting Elemental Focus within one spec. And this helps enhancement Shaman in PvE a lot. Elemental Focus being huge for mana sustaining in longer fights, and the Nature's Guidance to get hit capped as enhancement.
Alright, that was it for the changes made to Shamans here on Turtle WoW. Now I'll be covering some tips and tricks for leveling, as well as some theory crafting for raiding and endgame builds. Let's start with the endgame stuff, and then we'll move on to the leveling tips after. So let's start off with the enhancement. This build will likely be your go-to support build. We get the extra 3 hit for both spells and melee attacks in the restoration tree, and you should only get this hit if you are below hit cap. And then we go for most of the support talents in the enhancement tree. The goal with this spec will mostly be to support the raid, while your own damage will take a backseat. If you're already hit capped, then the 8 points in the restoration tree could be spent elsewhere. For example, in the elemental tree, to increase your own damage by going for elemental devastation. Or you could go with even more support talents in the enhancement tree. But let's say you don't give 2 pots of piss about your raid. You just want to do as much damage as you possibly can. Well, then I think this would be your go-to spec. With this spec, you're going to get both Storm Strike and Elemental Fury in the elemental tree. This spec also assumes that you're already hit capped, and this would likely also be your go-to PvP spec as enhancement. Now let's take a look at your options for elementals. There are, in my opinion, now 2 options. You could go either with the classic elemental build or a elemental enhancement hybrid build, since you now get Storm Strike earlier in the tree. So as many of you probably know, both your tier 2.5 but also your PvP gear is actually optimized for both enhancement and elemental, making this hybrid build a pretty viable option. On your tier 2.5 you have a lot of strength and agility. Also you have some crit with both melee and spells. And this is especially also true for the rank 13 PvP gear. The hybrid version of this build probably wouldn't be great for PvE, at least not when going for the lightning bolt, chain lightning talents, because every time you finish a lightning bolt or a chain lightning, it resets your swing timer. So therefore you would rather count on your shock spells than doing chain lightning spells. Unless of course you stand at a range and do DPS, but in that case pure elemental would be better. So in the end, this will probably purely be a PvP spec because of the dynamic stuff going on in PvP all the time. Suddenly you have your enemy at a range, and sometimes he's at close range
whenever he gap closes you, you'd hit him with a powerful two-handed weapon, especially if he's a caster that you don't need the shield with the extra armor. You want to have a big fat two-handed weapon to hit him and hope for a Wind Fury proc. Combine that with Storm Strike, you'd have an auto attack and a Storm Strike, so that's twice the chance of getting Wind Fury. And if he ranges you, let's say it's a mage, he novas you, now you still have Chain Lightning and Lightning spells and shock spells that are very powerful in this case to handle him. So as soon as the enemy is at range, you play as a Elemental Shaman and you weapon swap between a one-handed and a shield and a two-handed weapon, depending on the enemies that you're facing. Combine that with the shock spells and the fast lightning, chain lightning spells, you'll be a formidable foe in PvP. Especially if you're wearing PvP gear, rank 13 PvP gear, because that gear is not only optimized for elemental, but it also has a ton of stats for enhancement. So it's a mix of both. And as soon as you're at range, you're an elemental shaman. As soon as you're at close range, well, then you're an enhancement shaman, especially with this spec, because you get the Storm Strike, you get pretty much everything you would get from the old enhancement tree in Classic, and you get most of the most beneficial stuff from Elemental, except of course Elemental Mastery. And for Resto, not much has changed, so this would likely be my go-to spec for Resto, unless I'm missing something, but yeah, I think that's it. Moving on to leveling, and for leveling, the two general ways of leveling is either you go with, at least on the early levels, either you go with a fast one-handed weapon and a shield, or you go with a two-handed weapon. And for the really early levels, I'd recommend going with a two-handed weapon, because the armor you get from shields early on, it just isn't that much. So two-handed weapon until around level 15, maybe 20, and then I'd go with a one-handed weapon and a shield. I would probably, if you're going to go with a shield and a one-handed weapon, then I'd go for Elemental Focus as your first build, because now, as we discussed earlier, this can proc from melee attacks, and a fast weapon equals a greater chance to get a critical strike within one mob kill or within one fight, and therefore you're going to get many more procs, which will make your shock spells much cheaper to cast. You could optimize this, constantly casting a rank 1 shock spell, hoping for it to crit in order to proc Elemental Focus, combined with you constantly swinging with a fast one-handed weapon will also increase your chance of getting a Elemental Focus proc, and that way you could proc Elemental Focus more often. But I think that would overall, you'd disobey the 5-second rule, and you'd be losing too much mana because you won't be regenerating enough. So just as Kargers says, front load most of your spells, your DPS, and then wait for procs and use them if needed. The other option is of course going with shield specialization and thundering strikes, improved Ghost Wolf, which is the classic enhancement go-to build, and just continue down until you get Storm Strike, and then when you get Storm Strike you could consider, do I want to continue in the enhancement tree, get elemental weapons, or do I want to go over to get Elemental Focus? And quickly covering gear, Elemental Focus and Flurry, it procs off of crits. So your primary attribute wouldn't be strength, it would be agility. Especially at lower levels, agility scales much better. At high levels, at level 60, I think it's 20 agility equals 1 critical strike chance at melee for shamans. But at lower levels, 10 agility would be enough to get 1 critical strike, and even less at even lower levels. So agility, it is the real needle mover here, because more crit equals more procs of Flurry and more procs of Elemental Focus, which will increase your attack speed, which will again further even more procs and more crits. So that's an endless loop. You get many more, especially if you're using a one-handed weapon, a fast one-handed weapon with a shield. You'll get a shit ton of procs. And also if you're using Wind Fury in this case, you'll get even more procs, because each of the Wind Fury proc can also proc Flurry or Elemental Focus. So you'll have a constant uptime of these two when going for a fast one-handed weapon and a shield. I hope you enjoyed this video. Write which class you'd like to see next down in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
bye.